Before starting my paper, I'd like to introduce myself first. So I am a third year PhD student. Basically, I'm from Bangladesh. Before joining the PhD program here, I did my MBA in Illinois State University. Before joining there, I was working as a professor in back home. So it's like in University of Dhaka, I was a assistant professor there teaching risk financing. Then I decided to do a PhD in United States. Then I did my master's and got into this program. So far, I'm liking. I kind of changed my concentration from risk financing to here the corporate finance and capital market, and I'm enjoying a lot. Definitely working with the professors, learning a lot, and this is one of the outcomes that how I am enjoying the program so far. So this topic has kind of an interesting story. So as I mentioned that I was engaged in doing some risk financing research. So one of my interests was working with the climate financing. And like in Asian countries and European countries, this topic is kind of at that time for like 4 or 5 years back, it was a emerging topic. So I shared my interest when actually I didn't have no idea about what the research says. So Dr. Cumming asked me like, what's your interest? And I was just in the first semester of my PhD. And I told him that, okay, I have an interest in climate finance, natural disaster. Then he mentioned that, okay, so you do have an interesting interest. So let's work together. So he said that, how about connecting these natural disasters things with the manipulation? Then at the first, I was like, how can it be even possible? Like how to connect these two things together? Then I Googled some and I discussed with him back and forth. And like finally I found that there is a like very interesting connection, which is I'm pretty sure which is still not discovered in some other papers too. So this is how we progress with the ideas, and currently I'm working with Dr. Cumming as well with multiple ideas related with the market manipulation as well. We are working with corporate culture, how it can be related with manipulation, and some others. So this is how actually, as you told that this is a seminar for the PhD, prospective PhD students. So I tried to explain how can you progress with the ideas and how it works with when you work with your professors, how you can come up with some interesting ideas with your professor. Even if you realize that there is no link, there may be some links. So that's the story behind this paper, how we come up with the idea. So my paper's name is Death, Destruction, and Manipulation. And as the title shows, that it's a manipulation study which we are trying to link with death and destructions that are related to the natural disaster. All right, so I would like to start with a quote by famous actor and former governor of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger, who stated that I have starred in a lot of science fiction movies. And let me tell you something, that climate change is not a science fiction. This is a battle in the real world, and it is impacting us right now. So we know that the climate financing has been emerging, and there is a recent conference held in Glasgow, which is a huge conference. A lot of participants from around the world joined there, and they all are discussing how we all can combat the climate changing issues. And finance is also not an exception, who has a huge interest on climate as well. Focusing on that and keeping that in mind, let me explain what was the motivation for this paper. So in terms of climate change, we are mostly focusing on the natural disaster. Most of the papers so far has been done on the, most of the paper so far has been done on the carbon emission, how the carbon emission may influence the finance. But here we are mostly focusing on the natural disaster, the real natural disasters, and the damages caused by those natural disasters, and what are the impacts of those damages on the capital market. So we all know that there are huge damages by the disasters, just like the Irma, Harvey, or Katrina. And these damages also lead to huge destruction in the regular life. We, the people, are affected by that. There are a lot of destructions in our life. So these anxious people actually become pessimistic and take less risk. And it is also proven in the literature, like how the people actually react to this natural disaster, that they may be affected directly or may not be affected directly, rather they are affected indirectly. So and literature finds that sometimes people are over assuming the risk of the natural disaster, which may have a great impact on their investment decisions. So they can be more pessimistic, and they are less likely to invest in some particular stocks, and sometimes they are very much very much reluctant to invest even. So as a result, there may be a stock price movement which is completely unfavorable to the other investors who are not affected by natural disaster. On the other hand, destruction may cause indifference to price movement as well. For example, if I'm distracted by my personal experience of some natural disasters, so I may be indifferent what is happening in the real market. So it may happen as well. So given the investors' negative sentiment toward the natural disaster events, also given their indifference to the price movement, market participants such as fund managers, hedge funds, and mutual funds may follow different strategies to mitigate the negative sentiment or to take the benefits from those destructions. And it is proven in the literature that market players take the advantage of the people's distractions in terms of mutual funds, in terms of regular stock market, so securities. So they all have they like, it is proven in the literature like how they can customize the stock prices and in market and they manipulate the markets in different scenarios. So that is the main motivation of our paper, that how the natural disasters actually distract people and affects the sentiment of the people, and how these sentiments are utilized by the market players who are actually manipulating the market. So impacts of natural, as I mentioned, that impacts of natural disaster on manipulation is completely a new area. So literature has shown different determinants of market manipulation, but none of the literature before actually explained how the natural disaster may have an impact on market manipulations. So there are many studies which are done on market manipulation, but our study is different from them because we use a complete different measure for market manipulation. I will not explain my results too much. Rather, I'll focus mostly on the baseline results. If you are interested, definitely you can ask me questions like how I addressed. I didn't put all the slides in my today's slide presentation, okay? So depending on the motivation, it's kind of can be imagined like what can be my research question. So definitely my research question will be, how do the climate disasters work as a determinant of market manipulation? So before diving into the details of my analysis, let's have a look on the literature review. What are the works have been done so far in the market manipulation? So as I mentioned, that market manipulation is studied in the previous studies, but they used a different measure. So for example, I mentioned here a paper by Cumming et al. 2020. They actually wanted to look how it is difficult to determine the market manipulation, and they say that market manipulations is sometimes difficult to measure because there are scarcity of information, and also trading ahead of information announcement may be attributable to the issues such as market anticipation and volatility. Sometimes you cannot actually just claim something as a market manipulation. There may be different issues which are related, so it's a huge problem to detect the market manipulation. And also, Comerton, Ford, and Putnam explained that fund managers are involved in market manipulation to keep their funds performance high related to their competitors. So this is actually explaining why market manipulation is important to study, because market manipulation actually hinders people's confidence about the market. So we all, the ultimate objective is to reach as many investors as possible. So if the market manipulations hampers the investors' interest, so definitely it has to be studied, like what are the factors that may contribute to the market manipulation, right? And they also studied that information asymmetry is the most likely thing that actually causes the manipulation. So that is so far the conclusions about from the literature, like what actually explained. They explain mostly the information asymmetry thing that and volatility that actually explain market manipulations. So we will also explain like how these are related to the disaster and how these components can be affected by disaster, which will lead to actually the manipulation. So if we look at the natural disaster and market manipulation, market reaction studies, there are many studies in different areas of finance that actually look for how the natural disaster actually affect market reactions. It may impact positively or negatively as well. So a very recent study by Alok et al., they actually explained the natural disasters impact on the mutual funds, and they actually wanted to show how the mutual fund investment varies depending on the location of the disaster. So if it has any impact on how you manage your funds. Another study in Bordley et al. Did in 2012, they argue that investors may act in a risk-averse manner when they over-assume the downsides of a salient event, such as a natural disaster. So as I mentioned before, that was one of the motivations. Like if they over-assume, there may be some impacts like how their investment activity deviates when they are over-assuming a natural disaster. A study by Barnell et al., they actually focus on how the catastrophic disaster experience affect the professional investors. So these are pretty much like there are many other studies also that explain how the market reactions and market sentiments are affected by natural disaster. And in terms of a firm location study, we all know that there is a local or home bias presence in the local investors. So local investors tend to react the most when something happens in the headquarter locations. So it is also proven in the study that how the headquarter location affects investor sentiment, how it influences the information asymmetry presence in the like local investors as well. So as like when we presented this paper in multiple seminars, they explained like, why did you choose the headquarter location? That's a very important question to address. Like if a disaster happens in a headquarter location, so it is important to mention that we are actually focusing on the disasters which incurred in the headquarters. So why we are assuming that any disaster that occurs in the headquarters may have an impact on the investors. So we can refer to the literature, like literature explains that how home bias works, and this home bias theory definitely can be applied to whenever we do some kind of studies on the headquarter locations. And Pirensky and Wang in 2006 in their paper find that evidence that stock returns of the firms headquartered in the same location have a strong co-movement. So definitely the headquarter locations has a huge impact on how the local investors react. And there are some studies also who relate the investor reaction and stock prices. So here we want to see, okay, so look, we are claiming that natural disaster have some influence on the investors' reaction. And now we are focusing on how these investor reaction are actually impacting the stock prices. So this is how we build our literature, right? So we are connecting every concepts we bring in our study and try to give some kind of reference from the literature, like how they connected the concepts. So here I won't explain all the study, rather just talk about the Mian study on 2012. They find that sentiment-driven mispricing of earnings contributes to the general mispricing of stocks. So here they wanted to show how the sentiment actually influences mispricing of stocks. Okay, so based on the literature and based on the theories, we developed three main hypotheses. The first one actually explains continuous trading manipulation is more pronounced in months with disaster. So from this hypothesis, we want to see if the manipulation is pronounced during the month of disaster compared to the months of non-disaster. Second hypothesis deals with whether this association is more pronounced for the industries which are most likely to be affected by the disaster. So we kind of did an industry analysis to see whether our results are driven by any particular industry. Since we mentioned that we are from our hypothesis, from our theory analysis, from our literature review analysis, we are explaining that how the sentiment may drive the connection between natural disaster and market manipulation. So we also developed a hypothesis to see whether the local sentiment has any influence on this association between manipulation and natural disaster. And we developed three hypotheses corresponding to that. The first hypothesis says that disaster hazard mitigation program and community resilience mitigate the association between natural disaster and market manipulation. So we all know that there are many disaster hazard mitigation program by FMA, by different government agency. So what they do, usually for the localities which are mostly exposed to disaster, they are under some kind of a program. So if these programs are present, whether the association we found between market manipulation and disaster, if this is mitigated by this kind of programs or aid programs. And also there may be some community resilience among the people who are regularly exposed to the natural disasters. So if the effect is mitigated for those localities who are already tolerant of the disasters. And the very last hypothesis actually explain a high sentiment strengthens the association between natural disaster as market manipulation. So this hypothesis actually explains whether the association we found is triggered by the existing sentiment among the localities, like whether it is driven by the sentiment of the people as well. So in terms of methodology, I explained all the data sources I have used. This paper actually explained multiple data sources because to connect the financial elements with the natural disaster elements. So what we did, we collected, we have the securities listed in NASDAQ and New York Stock Exchange as our sample. We collected information from CompuStat, CRISP, the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Our sample ranges from 2007 and to 2018. We limit it for this period because of the availability of the manipulation data. And for the margin, it's a very interesting thing that whenever you do some studies on the locations, you try to narrow down your location measure as much as possible. That's why we actually consider here the county level information. So if we actually considered headquarter counties, and if that county is affected by any disaster, and that is how we connect our financial measures with the natural disaster measures. So we consider the headquarter locations and the natural disaster locations. And as in terms of controls, we use governance, information asymmetry. These are very common determinants of market manipulations. We control for the industry fixed effect and year fixed effects, and so on. So in terms of disaster data, we use the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration data. So that's a public data. It's free if you want to use for your research. And we actually consider the natural disasters in terms of damages. For the manipulation data, we collected the manipulation data from SMARS Incorporation and Capital Market CRC in Sydney. And as I mentioned, that we completely used a new market manipulation measure, which is a continuous trading manipulation metric, which detects an abnormal 30-minute change of liquidity, returns, and transaction cost based on some specific rules. For example, the number of alerts, trade value, and so on. So so far the previous literature focused on end of day price, opening price, dislocation value, but our study focuses on continuous trading manipulation. Here are the very basic summary statistics that explains like how our mean distributions are and standard deviation. And here it is important to mention we consider all the samples that were exposed and non-exposed to any disaster, and which also has manipulation and non-manipulation to make kind of a comparison analysis. Okay, so I will not explain much. Let's have a look on the manipulation trend. So this is so for the manipulation trend for our sample period, and it shows that there is a little fluctuation, and the recent days it's increasing. But in this graph, we wanted to see how the manipulation fluctuates before the disaster period, during the disaster period, and after the disaster period. Always the graph studies actually attract the audience, and also it it helps to summarize your results in a nutshell. Okay, so you see here, this is the 0, which is our disaster period, and you see there is a rise in manipulation during the disaster period, and it kind of gets minimized after two months of the disaster. So and like so on. So we can say it's a very basic graphic analysis. From this we can kind of get a notion like how the manipulation behavior changes during the disaster period. So first of all, we try to do a comparison of means analysis, where we want to see whether the manipulations differ during the disaster period and non-disaster period. And you see here the difference is positive and statistically significant, which actually shows that during the disaster period, the manipulations are higher for the firms. Then what we did, as I mentioned, that we actually considered the damages related to the natural disasters. So whether these manipulations are varies depending on what kind of damages these particular disasters are associated to. So some disaster may involve only property damages. Some may have direct deaths, huge direct deaths, or indirect or direct injuries. So which kind of disasters actually influence most in terms of manipulation behavior? And we see that it affects mostly when the disasters involve property damages, deaths, and injuries. All right. So that's also give a kind of an idea how the manipulation of behavior rises when there is a disaster. So here there is a very basic baseline regression. You see that in terms of manipulation, so these columns corresponds to 4 measures of our main dependent variable, which is our continuous trading manipulations. So you see here, and it is important to mention that we address the outlier issue. So there is no outliers, like we winterize the data at 5% level. So here you see that disasters that involve deaths and injuries are more likely to affect the manipulation behavior, and you see the coefficients are positive and statistically significant. I didn't mention here the economic significance, but it is mentioned in my paper that they are also high in economic significance. So what I did then I just focused or narrowed down my sample and only focused on the firms that were exposed to manipulations once during my sample period. I wanted to see those firms, how they behave when there was a disaster and there is no disaster. And you see also the results are very similar, and it is mostly significant for the disasters which involve deaths and injuries. So, and at table 5, we want to see whether there are these associations are different depending on what industries that particular firm belongs to. And you see there that the results are mostly consistent for the firms which belong to agricultural, health sector, and manufacturing sector industries. Okay. And however, the deaths and injuries are have the similar coefficient for all the industries we have in our sample. Okay, so I have many other tables in my paper, but for the time constraint, I didn't include it here. So the very last important thing that I want to mention, that some may ask that it is the volatility which are actually driving the manipulation. So we also got this kind of questions in several seminars. Then we realized let's do some kind of a volatility analysis, because it is important to see that whether the volatility actually is driving the manipulation. So you see here, we kind of did a graph analysis. Here you see that during the disaster, for all our samples which had a manipulation, but which we divided our samples in different combinations here. For example, manipulation non-disaster, manipulation disaster, non-manipulation non-disaster, and non-manipulation disaster. So these are 4 types of combinations we focused on, and in all the cases we see that during the disaster there is not actually any increase in the volatility, but we saw an increase in manipulations. So it kind of gives an idea that volatility is not actually driving our results. Also, we do have a volatility as a control in our regression analysis. Even after controlling for that, we saw that our results are significant and positive during the months of disasters. And okay, so here I summarize overall findings. We saw that there are differences in manipulation behavior during the disaster period, and also these are mostly prevalent for the affected areas. And the relationship is not driven by volatility. And in some other analysis, I also showed that government aid programs and community resilience kind of mitigated the relationship. And we also shown in our analysis that information asymmetry actually magnifies our relationship, as which is consistent with the previous literature. And we kind of did a difference in differences analysis to see the before and after analysis to see whether and focusing on some particular disasters to see if this disaster actually is influencing the manipulation behavior. And if you are interested, you can ask me for tables and to share the paper. This paper is available in SSRN. You can go over, and if you have any questions, please email me. I do have my email address with them. And lastly, just to tell about some of the limitation of our study. As I mentioned that we, and also contribution of our study. Yeah, so as I mentioned that we used a complete new measure, and also the regulators may implement different trading rules and increase their oversight during the exogenous shocks from the findings of our paper. And also we all know that exogenous shocks have a huge influence, and it's also a relatively new, not relatively new, is a recent study area where people, all the people actually focus on how to relate their studies on the exogenous shocks to do kind of causality or to establish the causality. And finally, the psychological cost. These are the limitations. We didn't focus on any psychological cost. There may be some psychological cost, and also we didn't analyze the results for different types of manipulation. We did have an alternative proxy for the manipulation in our study, but I couldn't show that in this slide because of the time constraint. And this study can be extended to the international perspective. Right now, we are only focusing on the US. So that's pretty much, I'm not sure how I deal with the time. Sorry about that if I take much time. Yeah, that's all. If you have any question.
So what strikes me in the paper that you have manipulation as observable. We tend to think of manipulation as something that is not observable, something that would be the result of investigation, and it's something that I kept on thinking, like, how do you have manipulation as an observable variable?
So the thing is, for example, if you look at our measure, we are trying to look at the standard deviation of the trading volume, the price. So for example, we kind of determined a threshold to say if the liquidity, for example, our trade volume moves between this standard deviation, then we would say that there is no manipulation. But if it crosses the threshold, then we can assume that this is something manipulated. It's not real. So that is how we actually addressed the manipulation. So although it's not observable, but you can observe it from the trading volume as well as the price movement.
Okay. Douglas, please.
Yeah, I was just gonna add to that is so we have a great partnership with a research institute in Sydney, Australia, that has developed a company that does surveillance software. And so the company was started in the late 1980s, and they sold their software to most of the major exchanges around the world. Actually, believe it or not, their first client was in Russia for the Moscow Stock Exchange. And so, but they've been used, the software is used in Australia, throughout Asia, Tokyo, Singapore, Hong Kong, in Europe, London, Switzerland, etc. And then in North America and South America as well. And it was recently purchased by NASD. And so we actually have the suspected manipulations for most of the major countries around the world. And these are manipulations like the actual data that goes to the surveillance authorities. So that type of partnership is extremely helpful for us to get real-time data on market manipulation. Now, whether something actually goes from a suspected case to an actual prosecution, is a different matter. But we have the real really great data set just by virtue of having made some partnerships with those folks. I spent a year in Sydney a number of years ago and regularly go back there to work with those folks.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. So there's a stock exchange involved. So, and the people who do essentially forensic investigation are involved. So you have the indication of possible manipulation. People are actually using those indicators to look at what's happening on the stock exchanges, and whether it makes into legal case or the prosecution is just another matter. Yeah, makes sense now.